Pink, I'm live. So I'm just on the still, so whenever they're ready, I'll dog up. And then the question is going to be ends now. I got my section should be good. And then since I have a license for that as well, and I need the contingency if it was live or not. Or like I decided if you were license, I would have been ready to go. I got I saw it. Yeah, we're ready to go. So good.
I was tapping in and out on his phone. My second phone. I was
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Come on in, take a seat. I hope you guys are excited for today's amazing conference. My name is Stockton Hawes. I am a part of the part of the Center for Constitutional Studies. I'm a Tocqueville Fellow under the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative. And on behalf of the Center for Constitutional Studies at UVU, I'd like to welcome you to our annual Constitution Day conference. Constitution Day is celebrated every year on September 17th. It commemorates the day in 1787 when the framers of the Constitution, after 3.5 months of deliberation in Philadelphia, signed the Constitution and sent it out for ratification. The theme of this year's conference is Parties in the USA, Does Partisanship Undermine the Constitution? To deliver our keynote address, I am pleased to introduce two scholars of the American constitutional tradition who are changing the way we think about partisanship in America. Dr. Verlin Lewis is a Sterling Scholar, or a Sterling Chair in Constitutional Studies at UVU. Dr. Hiram Lewis, Professor of History at BYU, Idaho. They are the authors of The Myth of Left and Right, from Oxford University Press, a book that is clearing the way American journalists and scholars think about and talk about partisanship and ideology. They are here to tell us more about how our ideas and words about ideology can undermine the stability of our constitutional republic. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you very much, Stockton. Anyone not hear me okay? Okay, great. So it's such a pleasure to be here at Utah Valley University. I think the Center for Constitutional Studies is doing the most important educational work in the world. Freedom depends upon our Constitution. And inasmuch as they're shoring up and strengthening the constitutional tradition of America, then our freedom is being protected here by this institution. So I have nothing but praise for what Professor Brogdon and others are doing here. I also noticed in the previous talk when Professor Brogdon was talking, a lot of you very admirably had put your cell phones away. Thank you very much for doing that. There's a time for cell phones, but during talks like this, I think it's good if we can put them away and just listen and focus for a little bit. Screen addiction's kind of got out of hand, and so if we can put our cell phones away, I think that would do all of us a lot of good. It would be less distracting, and we'll learn a lot more. Something that's really interesting is most of you here today are young. You're in high school. Now, some of you might be thinking to yourselves, well, this is an adult topic. They're talking about things that are for grown-ups, and that's not for me now. I'm here to tell you that that's not true, and in fact, the opposite is true. Because we're going to introduce some radical ideas. And it turns out what the neuroscientists have taught us is that the young brain is more plastic than the older brain. So I think everyone can profit from hearing our ideas, but a lot of people cling to the paradigms they've had their entire lives, and the older you get, the harder it is to change your mind. But you younger people have more plastic brains. You can be more receptive to what we're talking about and start to create the change that we need to make our politics more civil and productive. Okay, I'm going to give you a little spoiler here then. The question for this conference is, does partisanship undermine the Constitution? The short answer is no, not necessarily. And we'll talk about why that is. But as we'll see, partisanship per se doesn't necessarily undermine the Constitution, but partisanship with certain delusions that we'll talk about does. So what we're going to try to convince you today is to seek that good partisanship while avoiding some of that bad partisanship. All right. So our book is called The Myth of Left and Right, How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America. Now we'll start out with a point that should be obvious to a lot of people, but again, you young folks might not appreciate this. Those of us who are older remember a time when our politics wasn't quite as broken as it is today. I know we all have a lot of nostalgia. We all have a lot of bias, golden age. We look back and say how good things were back in the good old days. But it's true, in fact, in politics, and political scientists can actually measure this, that our hatred, that our sense of hostility and our politics are not as productive as they used to be in three ways. First of all, there's been some serious mistakes that our public officials have made. Now, whether you were in favor of the war in Iraq, against the war in Iraq, whether you think it was a mistake to do it at all, or just mistaken in how it was carried out, there were a lot of mistakes made there. Regardless of what you think about COVID policy, I think everybody agrees that our government made some serious, serious mistakes. Lots of errors in how they handled that. So it's broken on that level of a lot of errors being made. It's also broken on the level of inaction, that our government should be taking action to address important crises. There are certain environmental problems that require action. Certainly the government debt is a big problem, and if you're young, you should be especially concerned about this because you're the ones that are going to have to be paying it back. And our government has sat back and not addressed these questions. So inaction is another problem. But maybe the biggest problem of all is the hostility that Americans feel towards one another. Thankfully, a lot of kinds of hostility have decreased over the past couple of generations. Racial hostility has decreased, for instance. There's much less racial prejudice than there used to be. But partisan hostility has gone way up. Okay? And we'll give some ideas as to why we think that is.
Former Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Good to have you on the show.
I'm glad I'm on tonight because what you just said is totally erroneous. It is sad to watch what happened to you. It's sad.
Sad
You're a
to
total
watch what
sellout.
happened to me. I'm a sellout.
You are a sellout.
You
I'm gonna
are
tell
telling
you
me
why.
that I'm a sellout.
These
Yeah.
who are standing up for two systems of justice.
Oh, I'm
Joe
standing up for
Biden
two systems
can
of
be in,
justice.
you're just repeating spin. The prosecutor.
Oh, but
the
you
prosecutor,
don't, right? You're not
the-
spinning anything. Go
the
ahead.
I'm not spinning a damn thing.
Did you ask the Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden?
No, actually, I did.
So
Tad.
you did ask Ukraine to look into Joe Biden.
Of course I did.
Yeah, look, you should have your hand on your face. You know why? This is all a distraction from what I asked you for.
No, it
about
isn't
in
a
the first
distraction,
place,
Chris. What you just said is totally
is the
wrong. Let's
question.
talk like lawyers for a minute.
All right, good. Then respect
the
this
crime of
lawyer
bribery.
asking you. Hold on, I don't want to hear
The
it.
crime
Rudy,
of bribery.
Rudy, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole. of it
I
right now.
taught law. You're going to listen.
You
Anybody?
want to say I won't cover it because I'm like this, right? You say?
Oh man, when I
but now
watch
you
the
won't give me the
introduction to your
proof.
show, I'm not going to give you proof like
Now-
the stupid New York Times story the other day.
Now
right?
listen, if
Did you cover that? How the Times really screwed up the other day?
listen, if the
Did you cover it?
If the complaint had come out,
You don't answer that.
well, I'm trying to get a question out. Will you finally answer my question now that we're 12 minutes in?
Well, do we
Did
really
the
believe?
president?
We really believe he didn't know his son was under
Why won't
investigation?
you answer the question? What
What's
is
the
it with you?
question? What's the question?
Thank you.
If you don't want to hear from me, just cut me off.
No, I will never cut you off.
The fact is, you're
I look-
blinded.
Give
You're
me the
blinded by
affidavits.
your prejudice. And your network is a creature of the Democratic National Committee. I
Understand.
think your network is.
I know, I
wrong.
heard-
I think your network is a horror.
And say
I'm
it
not
all to me
personally
face to face
insulting
and
you.
we can get it out.
I
What
am
the hell you're not.
institutionally
But that's
insulting
okay.
you. I don't know
You've been very
anonymous
insulting. You've
complaints.
been very circumspect.
I'm
Very
very,
distracting.
I'm very insulting directly
So,
to your face. You
my
don't think
premise for
there's
the
a deep
question.
state?
Listen.
Of course there is. I know.
I
it.
think
I've
there's a little bit of a
confronted
deep state going on right in this
it.
conversation.
If Adam Schiff sent me a letter, I would just tear it up and throw it in the
Yeah,
garbage.
of course.
Biden's
So, look,
bribery in
one
Ukraine.
one
go
sticky
cover him
wicket at a
taking-
time.
It's all over the.
I've had enough. How about you? Okay. So the point being is that American politics is broken. I wish I could say this little exchange here was not typical, But sadly it is. This is the kind of level our political discourse has sunk to. This is how people behave when they're talking politics, and this isn't healthy. This isn't good for anybody. So what we're going to argue today is that yes, there are many sources of our political problems. And we don't have the answer to everything, but we think we have a partial answer. We think we know something that contributes to it. And that is that we have an incorrect framework. So frameworks are just ways that we humans organize our experience. We have to have frameworks. You see, all this data comes into our eyes and into our ears and into our senses, and we have to have some way to impose order on it. So frameworks are necessary. We have to have ways to think about things. We have to put it into stories and things like that. But the problem is, if you get your framework wrong, then you're going to get everything else wrong. And we're saying that our political framework is broken. The way that we are organizing political data, that's incorrect. And when that's incorrect, everything else is going to be incorrect. Now, ideas have consequences. Not everybody thinks that, by the way. Karl Marx believed that ideas didn't have consequences. The only thing that mattered in society was economics, was money. Money explained everything. And class interest explained everything. But most of us think, no, actually, if you have a good framework, you'll get good results. If you have a bad framework, you have bad results. That ideas do, in fact, matter. And that the better you're thinking about something, the better the consequences of that something will be. I'll prove it to you, by the way. I'll prove that Karl Marx was wrong. Some of you guys have heard about the four humors theory of disease. This was a framework that people used in the 19th century and before, for several centuries, to talk about medicine. And what the four humors said was that health is determined by the balance of these fluids in your body. So you got blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and if you're sick, it's because they're out of balance. That's the way the doctors were thinking. Now, believe it or not, the more education somebody had, the more likely they were to believe this theory. Okay? All right, so four humors. So if you come up to a patient and they're sick and you're a doctor, and you see their skin is warm, and they look kind of red in complexion, and they're swollen, your diagnosis is you have too much blood. You're out of balance. So to fix you, we're going to slice you open and cause you to bleed. That was the treatment that was commonly used for hundreds of years by medical professionals. As we know, those people would have been better off not seeking any medical attention. So bad framework had bad consequences to the tune of who knows how many millions of lives were lost because of this bad framework. Okay? Doctors doing all kinds of damage. So why did people adhere to this framework if it was wrong? Two reasons. First of all, it was simple. We humans like simplicity. We will sacrifice truth to simplicity sometimes. We have many competing impulses in our psyche, and we have an impulse to truth. We like the truth, but we also like simplicity. And sometimes we will push truth aside in the name of simplicity. And this theory was very simple. Medicine today, it's complex. You go to the doctor and they can't just say, well, one of your four humors is out of balance, right? There's thousands and thousands of diseases and many, many treatments in different circumstances. And doctors have to take account of this complexity. That's why they have to go to school for so long. It requires that to grasp the complexity. But doctors used to love this theory because it was so simple. To impose order on something as complex as the human body with a simple theory, that was very attractive. And then second, it seemed effective because guess what? Most of the people that doctors bled got better. And so they said, oh, it must be working. Okay? So it seemed effective. It had a lot of attractiveness. So the point being, bad frameworks have bad consequences, and bad frameworks persist because they're simple and they seem effective on some surface level. All right. Here is the four humors theory that we Americans are adhering to today. Okay? If you turn on cable news, if you read an op-ed, if you talk politics with somebody, almost immediately they will start talking about a political spectrum. That's our framework. They will immediately start placing people on the far right, the center, the far left, the center right, talking about politics in terms of a spectrum. Okay? And so this is attractive for the same reason that the four humors theory of disease was attractive. It's simple and it seems effective. Reducing all of politics to one line, wow, that really makes things easy to grasp. All right, so why does it seem effective? What's it effective in doing? Well, first of all, we notice something. Political scientists do. they noticed that certain issue positions tend to go together. So for instance, if you meet somebody who's against abortion, you can also know with greater than 50% accuracy that they're probably also against affirmative action, against gun control, in favor of drug control, probably supported the war in Iraq, probably in favor of tax cuts for the rich and all the rest. So the political spectrum seems effective in explaining that. So what political scientists have said is we have this correlation between all these issues that seem unrelated. What does abortion have to do with tax cuts? Well, they seem unrelated. No. Deep down, they must be related. There must be one big issue underlying all others. So it must be people's disposition towards change. If you like change, you're on the left wing of the political spectrum and therefore are in favor of abortion rights, in favor of higher taxes on the rich, in favor of more gun control, against more drug control, so on and so forth. And if you're against change, you'll have the opposite set of positions. So there's just one big issue underlying all others, change, and somebody's disposition towards change leads to their whole basket of positions. It's very simple. Okay, so it seems effective because indeed you can predict somebody's views with greater than 50% accuracy once you know what one of their views are. So it seems like they go together. So you either have a left-wing worldview, in which case you have a left-wing bundle of positions, or a right-wing worldview, which leads to a right-wing bundle of positions. Okay, now lest people think we're attacking a straw man and nobody believes this, I promise you could go up to pretty much any politician at any level of government and do the same thing. I'm going to pick on Senator Warren here for a moment. If you went up to Senator Warren and you handed her a list of all the things the Democratic Party currently believes, more aggressive action on climate change, all right, restoration of Roe v. Wade, more affirmative action, all the rest, dozens and dozens of positions. And you said, Senator Warren, here's 30 positions that the Democratic Party currently believes in. Which of these positions do you agree with? She would say, I agree with all of them. Now you'd say, Senator Warren, that's a remarkable coincidence. Here we have 30 different issues and politics, and you can place somebody on a spectrum based on how they fit on that one issue. She thinks, yes, there's just one issue. You're either on the progressive or conservative side of that one issue, and I'm on the progressive side. This is a very, very common way of thinking, and we're here to tell you it's completely wrong. Senator Warren is wrong, and that's not because she's dumb, any more than a 19th century doctor was dumb. She just has a bad framework. Some of the smartest people in the world believed in the four humors theory of disease, even though it was completely wrong. Some of the smartest people in the world today believe in the political spectrum, even though it's also completely wrong. Okay, so what's our thesis is? First of all, there are many issues in politics. Abortion is one issue, tax cuts are another, the war in Iraq is another, tariffs are another, healthcare policy is another, and so on and so on and so on. There are many issues in politics, not just one. The left-right spectrum can only measure one issue. So if there are many issues in politics and a spectrum can only capture one, we should not be using a spectrum. Okay? And what we'll point out is that what people think the political spectrum explains is much better explained by something else. When the doctor went up to the patient and said, the patient is hot, their skin is warm to the touch, and they're swollen, it must be because they have too much blood in their body? No. The better explanation was that there were antibiotics trying to fight disease. The better explanation was that there are microorganisms causing this person to be sick. So we're going to tell you about a better explanation than the idea of one issue. All right, I'll turn the time over to my brother to talk about some of the solutions to this problem.
Okay, so one of the things that I should say before I get started is that Hiram is clearly the first author on this book. So it's really his ideas behind the book that we're talking about today. So if you like what we're saying, he gets all the credit. If you don't like what we're saying, he also gets all the blame. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we go through this today. I also want to echo what Hiram said. I agree with him that you might be sitting there thinking, well, this talk is not really for me. Why as a high school student should I care about this kind of stuff? This is for voting age citizens, this is for adults, this is for grown-ups. I actually agree with him that when we talk to audiences, most of the time, older people have a really hard time grasping what we're saying for precisely the reasons that he's talked about. neuroplasticity. The older you get, the harder it is to understand what we're trying to explain to you today. I think you'll have a better chance of understanding our argument today than your parents and your grandparents. So I hope something can get through from what we talk about today. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of bad cop, good cop. Hiram's talked about the problems in our politics. He's talked about the political blunders. He's talked about the political hostility that we see in our politics. He's talked about the dysfunction that we see. I'm going to talk about what I see as some potential solutions for the problems that we face in our politics. And I'm going to begin where Hiram also began, which is with the Center for Constitutional Studies. I believe that the solution to our problems in our politics today is constitutionalism. I believe that it is an adherence to and a commitment to the principles of the United States Constitution. Among them, popular sovereignty, individual rights, the rule of law, the separation of powers, and federalism, among others. And so I am pleased with the opportunity to work with the Center for Constitutional Studies here at UVU, because I think, as Hiram said, the work that CCS is doing is some of the most important work being done in our country today. Because as you can see, the mission statement of the center is to prepare citizens with the broad understanding of thought and practices critical to the perpetuation of constitutional government, ordered liberty, and the rule of law. And I feel one of the great blessings of my life to live here in the United States under this constitutional regime. And I would love for my children and my grandchildren to receive and enjoy those same blessings of liberty that Hiram talked about. I think we can only do that if we maintain our constitutional order. But as Hiram said, it is under attack. So for the past 3.5 years, I've been thinking more and more about how I can defend the Constitution and its principles. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the public square today don't really care about the rule of law. They're fine if their opponents in the other party are held to account when it comes to the rule of law, but they're not that concerned about their own political leaders, their own party leaders being held to account. They care about popular sovereignty when their party wins the election, but they don't really care about popular sovereignty when the other party wins the election. They care about individual rights when it's talking about people in their tribe and their political party, but they don't really care about the individual rights of their partisan opponents. Why has partisanship gone so wrong? Why are people who are partisan so willing to undermine these principles of constitutionalism that we're talking about? Well, as Hiram said, I think the problem is with the myth of left and right, or one of the problems. There's lots of problems we can talk about, but the one we're going to focus on today is the problem of monism, thinking about politics in terms of a unidimensional spectrum. I think the solution to our problems today is pluralism. That's a $100,000 word, pluralism, but it basically means the idea that we can live together as a plurality of individuals and groups in society, that we don't have to impose our will on our neighbors, that we can leave people free to make choices for themselves and in their communities for themselves. That's the idea of pluralism, and I think that's the idea that we need to recapture in our political discourse and in our political culture. Once we believe in pluralism, then we will care about the rule of law for everyone. We want everyone to be treated equally under the law, not just special treatment to our co-partisans. When we believe in pluralism, we really want the outcome of free and fair elections to prevail, not just when our party wins. When we believe in pluralism, we actually care about the individual rights of all people, not just those who happen to be in the same political party as us. And when we believe in pluralism, we want the separation of powers because we're concerned about the centralization of power in any one set of hands, because we know that power could be used to harm us or to take away our freedoms. And the same thing with federalism. We will believe in federalism if we believe in pluralism, that most decisions should be made on the local level closest to the people that it affects. So that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about pluralism and how to recapture pluralism. The problem for our politics today is it has been undermined by monism. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Well, I'm going to begin with a quote from former President James Madison, sometimes considered the father of the United States Constitution. He had a tremendous role to play in the gathering of delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and in the drafting of the provisions that eventually went into that Constitution as it was ratified. And in the Federalist Papers, Madison explained what the principles of the Constitution are. And I recommend to all of you to read those 85 essays in the Federalist Papers. I'm going to quote, for starters, from Federalist 10, where he identifies one of the problems or potential problems in politics. And this is the problem of factions. He defines a faction as any one group that tries to promote its own interests at the expense of the public good. Any group that tries to get their own preferential treatment rather than what's good for the political community as a whole. And he said that factions are inevitable in politics. Human beings can't operate in politics without factions. You have to have them. So the question isn't, do you have factions or not? But what kind of factions do you have? So to go back to the question that we started with in the very first slide, the question isn't, do you have political parties or not? That's not a question. You have to have political parties. The question is, do you have good parties or bad parties? Do you have healthy partisanship or unhealthy partisanship? So in Federalist 10, James Madison wrote, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. The latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, an attachment to different leaders, have divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for the common good. The regulation of these various interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation. So it's inevitable that people will divide into parties, and that's fine. The question is, or the trick is, how can we have political parties or political factions that will promote the public good rather than undermine the public good? And the answer for Madison, he answers his own question in the Federalist Papers, is pluralism. That's his answer. He says, let's have lots of factions. If you only have 2 or 3 factions in a society, then one will frequently end up with the majority of the votes. And in a democracy, the majority rules. And in a democracy, that majority can impose their will on all the minority groups in society. So rather than just having 2 or 3 groups in society, have a plurality of factions. That's why he wanted to ratify the Constitution, to expand the republic from a small republic or a collection of small republics on a very small scale to a large republic that extended over the continent of the United States. So this is what he had in mind. And as Dr. Brogdon talked about in his introductory remarks, in the 1830s, some very wise political leaders created a 2-party system of coalitions. These were broad coalitions, parties that brought in a variety of people with different views and ideas. They agreed on a few things and disagreed on a lot of other things, but they worked together for a few common ends. But these parties were coalitions, broad coalitions of different factions. Each party had many factions within it. Unfortunately, today we have 2 parties that are increasingly homogenous, that everyone has to believe the same thing within the party. And if you disagree with the party on any one thing, you will be excommunicated from the party. You will be kicked out. You will be primaried out of the party if you don't agree with all 30 issues, as Hiram talked about with Senator Warren. You can't deviate from the party on even 1 or 2 things because that shows, according to the left-right myth, that you're a squishy moderate, that you're a centrist, that you're a rhino, right? Because you don't agree with everything that the party believes, because we've got into this way of thinking in terms of a left-right spectrum. Okay, so Madison gives us the solution to majority faction. He says it's pluralism. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party. And the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. So in a small republic, you get oppression. The solution, Madison says, extend the sphere. Have a big republic. And you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. So have lots of factions, a plurality of factions. Promote pluralism. That's the way to promote peace. So over the last year and a half, I've been thinking more and more about how can I be a peacemaker in my own life, and how can I promote peace in the communities in which I live. And I think pluralism is one of the ways to promote peace. And I think constitutionalism is the way to promote peace in our political culture. Okay, so we've talked about why pluralism is good. Why is monism bad? Well, George Washington hit it on the head in his farewell address when he warned Americans about bad partisanship. Again, as Hiram said, we're not against partisanship per se. In fact, we think healthy partisanship is vital to a healthy republic, to good politics in this country. But Washington effectively warned us against the wrong kind of partisanship, the bad partisanship. And he warned us against monism, this idea that there's just one issue, and there's only two ways to view politics, and there's just two groups, and these two groups are going to fight it out to the death. And if your party gets in power, it's simply a matter of imposing your will and shoving your policies down the throats of your opponent. That's monism. That's the kind of politics that we have today. And Washington warned us of that. He said the alternate domination of one faction over another, remember, this is only two factions because there's only one issue, according to the left-right spectrum, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. They want a Caesar. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. The fastest way to undermine our republic and to end democracy in America is demagoguery and turning to an individual who promises to solve all our problems if we just give them all the power. That is the danger of left-right thinking, that one side, the danger of thinking that one side is correct about everything and the other side is wrong about everything, which is what left-right thinking leads us to believe. Okay, so our founders understood that there are many issues in politics, not just one, as Hiram said, and there are an infinite number of ways to bundle together issue positions, not just two. They understood that. We have forgotten that. We don't understand that today. We think there's just one issue because we think there's a left-right spectrum. Change, for most people, that's what they think. Oh, if you're in favor of change or against change. Of course, it's clearly not true. Each party wants to change some things and preserve the status quo on others. It just depends on the issue. So our founders understood that there was lots of issues, but today the left-right spectrum tells us, no, there's just one issue. There's only two ways to think about politics. Where does this idea come from? They didn't think that. George Washington never talked about the radical left. Right? Thomas Jefferson never wrote about the extreme right-wingers. Where does this idea of a left-right spectrum come from? Well, it comes from the Bolsheviks in Russia. We imported this model from Russia in the 1920s, and we've been using it to our great detriment ever since, over the past century. And you can see, this is from Google Ngram, the increasing usage of these terms in English language publications over the past centuries. It's just taken off exponentially. More and more people, as Hiram said, you can't open a newspaper, you can't turn on cable news, you can't scroll through your social media feed, you can't have a conversation with someone without them bringing up terms like left-wing and right-wing, progressive and conservative. Everyone has bought into this myth that there's just one issue in politics and politics can be modeled on a left-right spectrum. It's a false model. We've imported it to our peril, and it's tearing this country apart. The reality is there's more than one issue in politics. This is just from the Pew Research Center. They just asked people, what do you think should be a top priority for the president and for Congress to address this year? And people gave lots of different issues because there's not just one issue. There's the economy. There's health care. There's the COVID pandemic. There's Social Security. There's education. There's terrorism. There's crime. There's immigration. There's budget deficits. Right? There's climate change. There are dozens of different issues. Why do we think there's just one? There isn't. There are hundreds of issues. Right? And what your view is on gun control doesn't necessarily have to dictate what your view is on drug control or abortion or aid to Ukraine. These are distinct issues. Your principles can inform your views of those things, but they don't all have to be bound together in the way that our two parties currently bind them together. Okay, so what people typically say when you say, well, what is the one big issue? If you think you can model politics on a left-right spectrum, what is it? What is this one dimension measuring? Most people will say, or a lot of people, maybe not most, but a lot of people will say, and the dictionary will say, if you look up these terms progressive and conservative in the dictionary, will say, well, it's your disposition toward change. As Hiram said, if you're on the left wing, you want lots of change, and if you're on the right wing, you're against change. But that's clearly not true, right? People who call themselves liberal or call themselves conservative want to change some things, and they want to preserve the status quo on other things. It just depends on the issue. Okay, so what's a better way to think about our two parties? Well, the better way to think about our two parties is not on a unidimensional spectrum, but think of them like baskets. For the sake of simplicity and for the sake of political coalition building, we have to have two parties, or don't have to, but in the American case, we typically have two parties. And that's okay. Two parties can be healthy. Think about two grocery baskets. Okay, so imagine that you go to the grocery store, right? You go over there to Walmart supermarket across University Parkway. You've all been there, I'm sure. And normally you go into the grocery store and you just go up and down the aisles and you get the things in your basket that you want. You go grab your cart and you say, okay, this week I want, those Lucky Charms and I want those Twinkies, or maybe you're healthy and you're going to, go get that kale and get that salad. Whatever it is, you throw that stuff in your cart and you get your 20 items or your 30 items and you go check out. Right? But imagine you go up to the grocery store and instead of letting you go up and down the aisles, they say, no, sorry, the doors are locked, you can't go in. But we've got two baskets out here that you can choose from, a red basket and a blue basket. Well, that's kind of like our two-party system, and that's okay. That's fine. A rational person would go look at the red basket and go look at the blue basket and say, neither basket has everything I want, and not everything in either basket are things that I like. But this basket has more of the stuff that I want than the other basket, so I'm going to choose this basket. And it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be better than the alternative. That's rational, right? That's what we did for most of our history in America when it came to American politics. We chose between those two baskets, a red basket and a blue basket. That's like going into the voting booth, right? Republican Party or Democratic Party? Okay, I got to vote for one of the candidates from one of the parties. I don't agree with everything from either candidate, but this candidate has more of the stuff that I like than the other one, I'm going to choose that candidate. This party has more of the stuff that I like than the other one, I'm going to choose that party. That's rational. What would be delusional is if you went to the grocery store and they gave you your red basket, your blue basket to choose from, and you said, aha, what do you know? This basket has everything that I wanted to get in the first place. And everything in that other basket is stuff that I hate. What are the chances? The chances are zero that would happen, right? That's impossible, statistically speaking. And yet that's what we think when we think in terms of a left-right spectrum. We say, aha, this party is right about everything because it's on the correct side of a spectrum, and this party is wrong about everything because it's on the wrong side of a spectrum. And therefore, anything that my party does, I can justify because the other party is wholly and irredeemably evil and stupid, and my party is wholly correct and intelligent and enlightened. Doesn't that make politics simple? It does, but it also makes people much more hostile and angry and unwilling to work together than they would otherwise be if they gave up this delusion of left-right thinking. So this is the myth of monism. This is the myth of the idea that there's just one issue in politics. Reality, the truth is pluralism. The truth is there are many issues in our politics. How do we know this? Well, it's clear from a lot of things. It's clear from survey data. It's clear from our basic common sense. It's clear from experimental data. It's also clear from American history. You can go back and look at what people who call themselves left or right believed in or advocated for at any given time in history. And there, on every single issue, you can find times when the quote-unquote left believed the opposite of what they do today, and the quote-unquote right believe the opposite of what they do today on any given issue. The meanings of left and right are constantly changing because they are not fixed. They don't exist. They're not real. They are just social constructs. They are groups. Left and right are simply social groups. Groups of people who meet together and change their views over time as their parties change over time. As the Democratic Party changes its positions, What is considered progressive or left-wing changes. As the Republican Party changes its position, what is considered conservative or right-wing changes. The meanings of left and right are constantly evolving along with our two major parties. Okay, so why do we make a big fuss about stop using the language of left and right and conservative and progressive? The reason that we make that argument is because we think words matter. So Hiram talked about in his presentation, ideas have consequences. Well, words have consequences too, because we can't think outside of language. We have to use words to think about the world around us. We have to have, as he said, mental maps or models of the world. And some models of the world are going to be more or less accurate. So if we're talking about a social group, don't call them left-wingers or right-wingers, because that implies something false. That implies that there's a coherent, enduring, trans-historical philosophy binding together those issue positions. Just talk about Democrats and Republicans. That implies something true. That implies that we're talking about a group of people who have decided to work together to achieve certain common ends together. And that's fine, and that's good, and that's healthy for our politics. But don't pretend that there is some enduring philosophy that makes those policies have to go together over time. Because when we do that, we re-entrench this false idea that one party must be correct about everything and the other party must be wrong about everything. So why is that a wrong way to think? What harm does that do? Well, not only is it false, it actually harms us. It creates mental prisons. It prevents us from being able to think in new and creative ways about the problems that we face as American citizens. It leads us to confirmation bias, right? So in order to understand the world in which we live and to find truth, we have to be willing to challenge our priors or challenge hypotheses. That's the entire scientific method, is testing hypotheses. But if we think a priori that, well, my tribe or my party is right about everything and the other party or tribe is wrong about everything, then I don't have to test any propositions. Before you even open your mouth, I know that you're correct about everything or you're wrong about everything. Because all I have to know is what side of the spectrum are you on? Well, that shuts down critical thinking. That shuts down persuasion and deliberation. And it causes people to retreat to media echo chambers. You probably all noticed this, right? You probably see it in your own news feed, right? So people who identify with Team Red, people who call themselves conservatives, will frequently watch Fox News, right? And they will go on Truth Social. Right? People who are on Team Blue, who call themselves progressives, will only watch MSNBC and go on Twitter and read the Washington Post or the New York Times. They inhabit media echo chambers that simply tell them what they already think and tell them what they already think is correct. What a shallow and sad way to live, right? What an intellectually debilitating way to live, to only inhabit these media echo chambers. But that's what this left-right thinking causes us to do. All right, so it not only makes us stupider than we would otherwise be, thinking in terms of left and right. Not that if you think in terms of left and right, you're a stupid person. You'd just be smarter if you gave up left-right thinking. It not only hurts our brains, it hurts our souls. Not that you're a bad person if you think in terms of left and right, but you'd be a better person if you gave up left-right thinking. Because left-right thinking promotes prejudice and bigotry. It causes us to treat people and say, oh, you're a part of that group, I know everything about you, and I don't have to get to know you. I don't have to listen to what you say. I don't have to get to know or hear or understand your arguments. I know everything about you because you belong to that group. Right? And it promotes the hostility. If you're in the wrong group, then now you're an enemy to me because you're on the wrong side of this political spectrum. So the myth of ideological polarization, the mythical idea that my political scientist colleagues believe in, this myth that there's one line, there's two poles on either end of the spectrum, and that our two parties have moved to these poles, that myth of ideological polarization is leading to a reality of affective polarization. That's just a fancy political science word that means our two parties hate each other more than they used to. So the myth that the parties have moved to ideological poles is leading to the reality that people do hate each other more because they believe it. Well, my party's over here on the far right or left, and that party's on the other far end of the spectrum. I must be so far away with them. I have nothing in common with them. I don't want to live next door to them. I don't want my kids to go to school with them. I don't want to associate with them. I don't want my kids to marry someone from that wrong tribe, right? It creates and perpetuates this kind of hostility that we see in our politics. We are at a breaking point in our politics. You all saw in the news this week, one of our major presidential candidates, there was another assassination attempt on his life. This is a scary place to be in our politics. There is so much hatred and anger and hostility, right, that we had after the 2020 election, a mob of American citizens stormed the Capitol building to try and stop Congress from tabulating the votes and the outcome of the presidential election. This is a scary place that we are in. And it will only get worse if we continue to talk in terms of politics, in terms of left and right, because it's causing people to hate each other much more than they otherwise would. So I know this is for you young people, you might be thinking, what kind of world am I inheriting? There's a lot of good in this world, but we have a broken political system in many ways, right? Now, there's a lot of good in our political system, and that good, in my opinion, comes from our adherence to the constitutional forms that we inherited from the framers of our political system in the 18th century. But to the extent that we've departed from their ideas, we have suffered as a result. To the extent that we have departed from pluralism, we have suffered as a result. To the extent that we have adopted monism and left-right thinking, our political culture has degraded as a result. So I will just end by saying that this left-right thinking is harming our politics. It's undermining our constitutionalism because it causes people to not really care about the rule of law, the separation of powers, federalism, individual rights, and popular sovereignty. People are willing to get rid of that stuff in the name of winning. As long as my team wins, I don't care about the rule of law. As long as my team wins, I don't care if all power is concentrated in the hands of the president. As long as my team wins, I don't care if we centralize more and more power in Washington, D.C. and take it away from states and counties and towns. As long as my team wins, I don't care about the individual rights of people in the other team. Right? That kind of thinking is really hurting constitutionalism. And it's going to lead to authoritarianism and totalitarianism if we can't pull out of this nosedive. We should not be surprised if we use, to go back to what Hiram said at the very beginning, a totalitarian framework, that there's just one issue and we can totalize all of politics onto a single line. That's a totalitarian framework. And it leads, sadly, to totalitarian outcomes. Okay, so how can we improve? I hope we can leave you on a positive note. We've talked about doom and gloom, but there are things that we can do to improve our politics and to save our constitutional order and return to the principles of the American founding. The first is to recognize the myth for what it is. Recognize that when anyone talks about left or right, or progressive or conservative, they might as well be talking to you about Leos and Capricorns and astrology. I mean, it's just utter nonsense that they are engaging in. Recognize that this is a myth. And refuse to reinscribe the myth. Refuse to engage in their rhetorical approach and say, I just refuse to be a part of that left-right way of thinking, and I'm just going to talk about issues. I'm going to talk about tax policy or healthcare policy or aid to Ukraine or the Gaza war or abortion or whatever it is, and just talk about the issues. Change our speech. If we change our speech, we can change the way we think, because words are ideas. We have to change the way that we speak with each other. Fourth, I would encourage you to find healthier tribes. For many people, liberalism or conservatism is their religion. They might tell you that they are Christian or Buddhist or Jewish or Islamic, but for a lot of them, actually progressivism and conservatism are their real religions. And you can just do some self-examination. If you are a religious person, how much time do you spend reading from the scriptures of your religious faith tradition? And how much time do you spend engaging in the ideological homogenization of your political newsfeed? How much time do you spend scrolling through Twitter or Truth Social or online, just listening to people who you already agree with tell you how great you are and how horrible the other side is. We need to set aside those unhealthy tribes that are based on a lie, the left-right tribes, and embrace healthier tribes, like your church congregation, like your local service organization, like your local clubs, sports teams, things that actually make you get to have face-to-face conversations with other people, engage in real friendships and relationships, and not these kind of unhealthy obsessions over national politics. And then finally, I would encourage you to, as you give up monism, to promote pluralism and constitutional government. So we'll end there and we'll open up for Q&A. Thank you. So I think we've got, what is it, 8 minutes? We've got